600 men climbed out of their trenches at dawn, knowing they would charge across 20 meters of open ground into waiting machine guns. 7 minutes earlier, someone's watch had been wrong. It is March 18th, 1915. The French battleship Bouvet has just struck a mine in the narrow waters of the Dardanelles. 12,000 tons of steel begins to roll. 710 men scramble across tilting decks as the Mediterranean rushes through torn hull plates. The ship capsizes in under 2 minutes. 639 sailors disappear beneath the gray water. Around the dying vessel, the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the eastern Mediterranean continues its advance, unaware that beneath their keels lies a hidden line of mines that will claim 2 more battleships before sunset. In London, a 40-year-old politician has staked his entire career on this single bold stroke. 6 weeks earlier, that man had sat in a wood-paneled office in Whitehall, convinced he had found the key to ending the deadliest war in human history. By the winter of 1914, the Western Front had become a graveyard, stretching 700 kilometers from the Swiss border to the English Channel. Millions of men faced each other across a wasteland of mud, barbed wire, and shattered trees. The great armies of Europe had fought themselves to exhaustion, and neither side could break through. Every attack produced the same result. Thousands dead for a few hundred meters of churned earth, then a counterattack, then more dead. The generals promised breakthrough. The politicians demanded results. The soldiers simply died. In the east, the situation was equally grim. Russia, the great Allied hope for crushing Germany between 2 fronts, was struggling. The Tsar's armies had suffered catastrophic defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. Now the Ottoman Empire, which had joined the Central Powers in November, was pressing into the Caucasus Mountains, threatening to knock Russia out of the war entirely. On the 2nd of January 1915, Grand Duke Nicholas sent an urgent appeal to London. Russia needed help. The pressure had to be relieved. Something had to be done. In the corridors of British power, one man believed he had the answer. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was 40 years old and at the peak of his ambition. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he commanded the most powerful navy on earth. He was brilliant, energetic, and utterly convinced that the slaughter on the Western Front could be avoided if only the war could be won somewhere else. The Ottoman Empire, he argued, was the weak link in the chain of Central Powers, the sick man of Europe. A single bold stroke could knock the Turks out of the war, open a supply route to Russia through the Black Sea, and perhaps convince the wavering Balkan states to join the Allies. What Churchill proposed was breathtakingly simple. The Royal Navy would force its way through the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara. Once through, the fleet would steam to Constantinople, the Ottoman capital. Faced with British battleships at their doorstep, the Turks would have no choice but to surrender. The war in the east would be over. The supplies would flow to Russia. Germany would face the crushing pressure it had always feared. There was just one problem. 4 years earlier, Churchill himself had written that it was no longer possible to force the Dardanelles, and that nobody would expose a modern fleet to such peril. He had changed his mind. What Churchill did not fully appreciate was what awaited on the other side of that narrow waterway. The Ottoman Fifth Army had been quietly preparing for exactly this scenario. Over 100,000 men would eventually defend the peninsula, commanded by German General Otto Lehmann von Sanders, who had spent years modernizing Turkish forces. Among his subordinates was a 34-year-old lieutenant colonel named Mustafa Kemal, commanding the 19th Division. Kemal was ambitious, brilliant, and frustrated by the Germans who dominated the Ottoman military establishment. He had studied the terrain of Gallipoli during the Balkan Wars. He knew where the British would land. His superiors ignored his warnings. The British war planners made assumptions that would cost tens of thousands of lives. They assumed the Ottoman defenses would crumble under modern naval firepower. They assumed Turkish soldiers would flee rather than fight. They assumed that old battleships, vessels too outdated to face the German high seas fleet, could do the job alone. Ground troops would not be needed, at least not initially. The Navy would handle everything. There was another factor driving the urgency, one that historians would only fully appreciate decades later. With the Dardanelles closed, Russian grain could not reach world markets. Britain faced wheat shortages and soaring prices. Opening the straits would release Russian exports and ease the crisis at home. The strategic, the political, and the economic all pointed toward the same narrow waterway. On the 19th of February 1915, the bombardment began. British and French battleships opened fire on the outer forts guarding the entrance to the Dardanelles. The ancient fortifications at Sed el Bahr and Kum Kale crumbled under the weight of naval shells. Initial success bred confidence. The outer defenses fell within a week, but as the fleet pushed deeper into the strait, a new problem emerged. The waterway was defended not only by guns, but by mines. Hundreds of them strung in lines across the channel, waiting in the cold water for the hulls of Allied ships. The mines could not be cleared until the guns were silenced. The guns could not be silenced until the fleet advanced. The fleet could not advance until the mines were cleared. It was a deadly circular trap, and the British had sailed directly into it. The task of clearing the mines fell to a flotilla of converted fishing trawlers, manned not by naval crews but by civilian fishermen. These men had no training for combat. When Turkish shore batteries opened fire, the trawlers fled. Night after night they tried. Night after night they failed. The minefields remained. The strain proved too much for the British naval commander. Admiral Sackville Carden suffered a nervous collapse and was replaced by Vice Admiral John de Robeck. On the morning of March 18th, de Robeck committed nearly his entire fleet to a decisive assault. 16 Allied battleships steamed into the Narrows, the tightest section of the strait, where the guns were thickest and the water narrowest. At first, the attack seemed to be succeeding. Turkish fire was fierce but appeared to be weakening. What the British did not know was that the defenders were running out of ammunition. More than half the Turkish shells had been fired. The minefields were nearly exhausted. Victory, improbable as it seemed, might have been within reach. But 10 days earlier, a Turkish mine expert named Lieutenant Colonel Gil Bey had secretly laid a new line of 20 mines parallel to the Asian shore. This single line of explosives would doom the entire attack. When the Bouvets struck the first mine just after 2 in the afternoon, the Allied commanders assumed it was a lucky shot from the shore batteries. They pressed forward. Within hours, HMS Irresistible had struck a mine and begun to sink. HMS Ocean, sent to assist, hit another mine and joined her. The battlecruiser Inflexible was crippled. 3 battleships sunk. 3 more badly damaged. Over 700 sailors dead. As the sun set over the Dardanelles, de Robeck made the decision that would shape the rest of the campaign. He called off the attack. The fleet withdrew. The tragic irony would haunt Churchill for the rest of his life. Had the attack resumed the following morning, it might well have succeeded. The Turkish guns were nearly silent, their ammunition spent. The minefields were almost cleared. The defenders themselves expected to be overwhelmed. But de Robeck had seen enough. The Navy alone could not force the Dardanelles. The burden now passed to the Army. Ground troops would have to land on the Gallipoli Peninsula, capture the shore defenses, and clear the way for the fleet. What was meant to be a swift naval stroke had become something far more dangerous. An amphibious invasion against a now alerted enemy who had been given precious weeks to prepare. The gamble had begun. The stakes were about to become clear. The man chosen to redeem the Navy's failure was General Sir Ian Hamilton. He was 62 years old, charming, experienced, and utterly unprepared for what awaited him. On the 12th of March 1915, Hamilton received his orders. The following day, he left London. His planning period had lasted less than 48 hours. He arrived at the staging island of Lemnos on March 17th, one day before the naval disaster in the Narrows. He had requested modern aircraft and experienced reconnaissance crews. The request was denied. Such valuable resources were needed on the Western Front. Hamilton found himself commanding a force of approximately 75,000 men. The British 29th Division was his strongest formation, regular Army veterans who had been recalled from garrison duties across the Empire. The Royal Naval Division consisted of sailors trained to fight as infantry. The French Corps Expeditionnaire d'Orient contributed 17,000 troops. The 29th Indian Brigade brought Gurkha and Indian soldiers. And then there were the Australians and New Zealanders, some 17,000 men who had never seen combat, formed into a corps that would soon be known by its initials, Anzac. The maps Hamilton carried were hopelessly inaccurate. The terrain his staff described bore little resemblance to reality. British intelligence had convinced itself that Turkish soldiers would flee in the face of determined assault. The actual landscape of Gallipoli, a nightmare of steep ravines, knife-edged ridges, and dense scrub, would come as a terrible surprise. Hamilton's plan called for landings at two main points. The British 29th Division would assault Cape Helles at the southern tip of the peninsula, landing across 5 separate beaches. Their objective was to advance 6 miles inland on the first day and capture the heights of Achi Baba. Further north, the Anzac forces would land near Gaba Tepe on the western coast, drive across the peninsula, and cut Turkish communications with the south. A French force would create a diversion on the Asian shore at Kum Kale. The Royal Naval Division would feint at Bulair, at the narrow neck of the peninsula, to confuse the defenders about where the main blow would fall. On the Turkish side, Mustafa Kemal had positioned his 19th Division as the strategic reserve, stationed inland where it could respond to threats from any direction. He had warned his superiors that the British would land at exactly the points Hamilton had chosen. They had not listened, but Kemal was watching and waiting. In the darkness before dawn, on April 25, 1915, an armada of ships assembled off the Gallipoli coast. Aboard the transports, young men from Australia, New Zealand, Britain, France, and India prepared to go ashore. Most had never experienced combat. By nightfall, thousands of them would be dead. The Anzac landing was scheduled for the beach near Gaba Tepe, a relatively flat stretch of coastline where troops could quickly push inland. But the currents that night ran stronger than expected. The boats drifted north. When the first wave of the 3rd Australian Brigade touched shore at approximately 4:30 in the morning, they found themselves not on the intended beach, but in a narrow cove, backed by impossibly steep cliffs. The site would soon be known as Anzac Cove. Initial resistance was light. Only about 250 Turkish soldiers defended this stretch of coast, and they were as surprised as anyone by where the Australians had landed. But the terrain immediately became the enemy. Instead of open ground leading to achievable objectives, the Anzacs faced a labyrinth of ravines, gullies, and razorback ridges choked with dense scrub. Units became hopelessly intermixed in the darkness. Companies lost contact with their battalions. Officers lost contact with their men. The neat plans dissolved into chaos. From a ridge inland, Lieutenant Colonel Sefik Aker of the Turkish 27th Regiment had spotted the approaching fleet at 2 in the morning. He reported the sighting to his battalion commander, Major Ismet, who dismissed the concern. At most, the landing would be at Gaba Tepe. There was no cause for alarm, but as the sound of gunfire grew louder, the truth became impossible to ignore. Mustafa Kemal received the first reports as dawn was breaking. Without waiting for orders from above, he made the decision that would change the course of the campaign. He gathered his division and began marching toward the sound of battle. His superiors had not authorized this movement. The chain of command had not been consulted. Kemal simply saw what needed to be done and did it. The Australians, despite the confusion, were pushing inland. Small groups of men, sometimes just a handful, scrambled up the steep slopes toward the ridgeline. If they could reach the heights of Chunuk Bair before Turkish reinforcements arrived, they would command the entire peninsula. From those heights, the Dardanelles themselves would be visible. The goal of the entire campaign lay just a few kilometers away. Kemal reached the critical ground first. On the slopes below Chunuk Bair, he encountered soldiers from the 27th Regiment, retreating in disorder. When an officer told him the men were out of ammunition, Kemal gave an order that would become legend. If they had no bullets, they still had bayonets. They were not to attack, he told them, they were to die. In the time it took them to die, other forces and commanders could come and take their place. It was not empty rhetoric. Kemal positioned himself at the front of the counterattack, exposing himself to the same fire that was cutting down his men. His forces slammed into the advancing Australians just as they were approaching the heights. The race for Çanakkale was over. The Turks had won it by minutes. By mid-morning, the momentum had shifted entirely. The Anzacs found themselves pinned to the steep slopes above the beach, unable to advance, taking fire from positions they could not see. Turkish reinforcements continued to pour into the heights. By nightfall, over 2,000 Australians and New Zealanders had been killed or wounded. The objective of crossing the peninsula would never be achieved. Not that day, not any day. That evening, the Anzac commanders sent word to General Hamilton that the position was untenable. They recommended evacuation. Hamilton, watching from offshore, sent back a single order: dig in. 20 kilometers to the south, the landings at Cape Helles had become a different kind of nightmare. The plan at V Beach called for a converted coal ship named SS River Clyde to serve as a Trojan horse. This 4,000-ton vessel had been modified with large openings cut into her hull, through which 2,000 soldiers would emerge onto gangways and then onto smaller boats, bridging the gap to the shore. It was an ingenious plan. It would become a death trap. Defending V Beach was a single Turkish company of approximately 250 men. They had positioned 4 Maxim machine guns with perfect fields of fire covering the water and the narrow strip of sand. As the River Clyde approached and grounded herself beneath the old fortress of Sed El Bar, a staff officer aboard the ship recorded the moment in his diary. 6:22 in the morning, ran smoothly ashore without tremor, no opposition, we shall land unopposed. 3 minutes later, he wrote again, hell burst loose on them. One boat drifting to north, all killed. Others almost equally helpless. The first soldiers to emerge from the River Clyde were cut down before they could reach the gangways. Those who made it to the lighters found themselves trapped on the small boats, exposed to withering fire from 3 directions. Bodies piled up on the gangways, blocking the path for those behind. Men drowned under the weight of their equipment trying to wade ashore. The water around the ship turned red. Commander Edward Unwin, 51 years old and captain of the River Clyde, repeatedly left the ship to hold the lighters in place so that others might have a chance. 6 Victoria Crosses would be awarded for the attempts to maintain that bridge from ship to shore. By the end of the morning, 300 of the 700 Dublin Fusiliers who had attempted to land were dead. The survivors huddled behind the steel hull of the stranded ship, waiting for darkness to try again. At the other beaches, the story varied. W Beach saw the Lancashire Fusiliers fight their way ashore against heavy resistance, earning the legend of 6 Victoria Crosses before breakfast. At X Beach and S Beach, the landings met little opposition. But most remarkable was Y Beach, where 2,000 British soldiers came ashore virtually unopposed. They outnumbered the entire Turkish garrison in the southern half of the peninsula. A determined advance might have rolled up the Turkish defenses from behind. Instead, their commander waited. When Turkish reinforcements finally arrived, the force was evacuated without having fired a shot in anger. The official historian would later conclude that with 2 reserve battalions available, Helles and Sed El Bar would have fallen by midday. The opportunity was there. It was not taken. By nightfall on April 25th, the grand strategic vision had collapsed into brutal reality. Objectives achieved, none. Territory gained, narrow beachheads where men clung to cliffs and beaches under constant fire. Total casualties for the day approached 18,000 on the Allied side alone. The Turks had suffered comparably. What was meant to be a bold stroke to end the war had become something terrifyingly familiar. The trenches were already being dug. Within days of the landings, Gallipoli had become a mirror of the Western Front. The same trenches, the same barbed wire, the same impossible mathematics of attack and defense. In some places along the Anzac perimeter, the opposing lines were separated by less than 4 meters. Men could hear their enemies breathing. They could smell them. They threw grenades back and forth like deadly tennis balls, counting the seconds before the fuses burned down. At Helles, General Hamilton launched 3 successive attacks against the village of Krithia and the heights of Achibaba beyond. The first battle came on April 28th, just 3 days after the landings. It failed. The second battle raged from the 6th to the 8th of May. It failed. The third battle consumed the 4th of June. It too failed. Each assault followed the same pattern: artillery bombardment, infantry advance, machine gun fire, retreat. Thousands of casualties for gains measured in meters. But it was not only Turkish bullets that were killing Allied soldiers. By summer, a new enemy had taken hold of the peninsula. Dysentery spread through the trenches like wildfire. The disease bred in conditions that seemed designed to maximize human suffering. Unburied corpses rotted in no man's land under the Mediterranean sun. Latrines overflowed in soil too rocky to dig properly. Refuse piled up in gullies and ravines. And everywhere, in numbers beyond counting, were the flies. They swarmed over the dead and the living alike, carrying infection from corpse to latrine to mess tin. A man could not eat without swallowing flies. He could not sleep without them crawling across his face. Water was desperately scarce. At Anzac, there were no natural springs. Every drop had to be brought ashore by boat. The summer heat climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men went days without washing. Their uniforms rotted on their bodies. Lice infested every seam of every garment. The stench was indescribable. By late July, hundreds of soldiers were collapsing from illness every single day. Many refused evacuation, knowing that if they left, their mates would have to carry a heavier burden. They stayed in the trenches with cramping guts and bloody dysentery, too weak to stand, still clutching their rifles. 90,000 British Empire soldiers would eventually be evacuated from Gallipoli due to sickness alone. The official medical history would call it the disease debacle. In the midst of this suffering, there came one moment of unexpected humanity. On the 19th of May, the Turks launched a massive assault against the Anzac positions. 42,000 soldiers surged forward in the darkness before dawn. The attack was a catastrophe. Australian and New Zealand machine guns cut down wave after wave of attackers. By the time the sun rose, over 10,000 Turkish soldiers lay dead or dying in no man's land. The corpses could not be left where they had fallen. In the heat, they would become a source of epidemic. On the 24th of May, a 9-hour armistice was arranged to bury the dead. For one morning, the killing stopped. Soldiers from both sides climbed out of their trenches and walked among the fallen. They exchanged cigarettes. They showed each other photographs of wives and children. They looked into the faces of men they had been trying to kill and saw themselves reflected back. Then the truce ended. They returned to their trenches. The war resumed. The armistice was never repeated. By August, it was clear that something dramatic had to be done. Hamilton devised one final gamble to break the stalemate. The plan was ambitious. A fresh landing would be made at Suvla Bay, north of the Anzac perimeter, by 20,000 troops of the newly formed 9th Corps under Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stopford. Simultaneously, Anzac forces would break out of their confined beachhead and assault the heights of the Sari Bear Ridge. The objectives were Chunuk Bear at 850 feet and Hill 971 at the summit of the range. If those heights could be taken, the entire peninsula would lie open. The Dardanelles themselves would finally be within reach. To mask the main assault, diversionary attacks would be launched at multiple points. The most significant would come at Lone Pine, on the southern end of the Anzac sector, where Australian infantry would storm the Turkish trenches in a frontal assault designed to draw enemy reserves away from the true objectives. At 5:30 in the evening on August 6th, the Australians rose from their trenches at Lone Pine and charged. They crossed the open ground under a hail of rifle and machine gun fire, expecting to find standard trenches on the other side. Instead, they discovered that the Turks had roofed their positions with heavy timber, creating underground bunkers. The Australians had to tear through the logs with their bare hands to get at the defenders below. What followed was 4 days of the most savage hand-to-hand fighting of the entire campaign. Men killed each other with bayonets, rifle butts, fists, and teeth in the darkness of those underground tunnels. Trenches changed hands again and again. The dead were piled so thick they had to be used as sandbags. When the battle finally ended, 2,300 Australians had been killed or wounded. Turkish casualties exceeded 6,000. 7 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the action at Lone Pine, the highest number ever given for a single engagement involving Australian forces. As a diversion, it had succeeded magnificently. As a contribution to the larger offensive, it would prove meaningless. While the slaughter continued at Lone Pine, the main assault columns were moving through the darkness toward the Sari Bar Heights. The plan called for precise coordination, multiple forces converging on their objectives simultaneously as dawn broke on August 7th. Nothing went according to plan. The columns lost their way in the maze of ravines and gullies. Units became separated. Guides led formations into dead ends. The New Zealand Infantry Brigade, tasked with capturing Chunuk Bair, did not reach their assault position until well after sunrise on August 7th. The element of surprise was gone. But it was at a narrow saddle of land called the Neck that the morning would claim its most terrible toll. The Neck was a strip of ground barely 20 meters wide connecting the Australian positions on Russell's Top to the Turkish-held knoll of Baby 700. The 3rd Light Horse Brigade had been ordered to charge across this killing ground in support of the New Zealand attack on Chunuk Bair. 600 men would go over the top in 4 waves of approximately 150 each. They carried rifles with unloaded chambers, only bayonets, only grenades. The attack depended on an artillery bombardment to suppress the Turkish defenders. But the bombardment stopped 7 minutes early. Someone's watch was wrong. In those 7 minutes, the Turkish soldiers returned to their firing positions and readied their machine guns. The New Zealanders, who were supposed to be attacking Chunuk Bair simultaneously, were nowhere near their objective. At 4:30 in the morning, the first wave went over the top. They were cut down within seconds. Not a single man reached the Turkish trenches. The second wave followed immediately. The same result, bodies piled on bodies in the narrow strip between the lines. An officer asked permission to halt the attack. Colonel John Antill, commanding in the absence of the brigade's wounded leader, refused. "Push on," he ordered. The third wave climbed the parapet and died. By the time the fourth wave began its advance, some officers were trying to halt the slaughter. A few men made it over before the order to stop finally came through. 372 of 600 men had been killed or wounded in a matter of minutes. The Turkish defensive positions were completely intact. It does not appear that the charge caused the death of a single enemy soldier. When burial parties returned to the Neck after the war, they found the remains of more than 300 men in an area the size of 3 tennis courts. Only 5 could be identified. One of them was Trooper Harold Rush of the 10th Light Horse Regiment. His headstone carries the words his mates remembered him saying as he went over the parapet. His last words, "Goodbye, Cobber. God bless you." On Chunuk Bair itself, the New Zealanders finally reached the summit on the morning of August 8th. For 2 days, they held the height against constant Turkish counterattacks. From that position, they could see the glittering waters of the Dardanelles. The goal of the entire campaign lay spread out before them. But reinforcements did not arrive in sufficient numbers. On the morning of August 10th, Mustafa Kemal personally led a massive counterattack against the exhausted defenders. The Turkish assault swept the British troops from the heights in a single devastating morning. Of the 760 men of the New Zealand Wellington Battalion who reached the summit of Chunuk Bair, 711 became casualties. The heights were never recaptured. At Suvla Bay, the story was different in its details, but identical in its outcome. The 9th Corps had landed on the night of August 6th against almost no opposition. Only 4 Turkish battalions defended the entire area. For 24 hours, the British had overwhelming numerical superiority. The hills surrounding the bay were there for the taking. General Stopford remained aboard his ship. His division commanders displayed the same paralysis. Instead of racing for the high ground, the troops halted on the beaches. Some officers were reportedly seen drinking tea, while the opportunity of the campaign slipped away hour by hour. By the time the British finally advanced, Turkish reinforcements had arrived. Mustafa Kemal took command of the sector and sealed the heights. The August offensive was over. The last chance to salvage the Gallipoli Campaign had been squandered. The failure of the August offensive settled over Gallipoli like a shroud. Through September and October, the lines remained frozen. Men died every day from sniper fire, from random shells, from the diseases that continued to ravage the trenches. But there would be no more great attacks. The campaign had exhausted itself. In London, the political ground was shifting beneath the feet of those who had championed the operation. The coalition government that had formed in May was growing impatient with the endless casualty lists and the absence of any progress. Critics who had warned against diverting resources from the Western Front now demanded answers. Who was responsible for this disaster? Who had sent so many men to die for nothing? In October, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. A direct rail link now connected Germany to the Ottoman Empire. Within weeks, German heavy artillery began arriving at Gallipoli, weapons capable of destroying the flimsy Allied fortifications that had been scraped together over months of desperate fighting. Modern German aircraft appeared in the skies above the peninsula. The balance of power, already tilted against the Allies, shifted further still. General Hamilton was recalled to London in October. His military career was finished. He would never command troops again. In his place came General Sir Charles Munro, a Western Front man who had no illusions about what he was inheriting. Munro visited all three Allied positions, Hellas, Anzac, and Suvla, in a single day. He saw the narrow beaches dominated by Turkish heights. He saw the exhausted, disease-ridden troops clinging to positions that could never be expanded. He saw a campaign that had no future. Munro's recommendation was immediate and unequivocal: evacuate. Winston Churchill, watching his grand strategy collapse from his diminished position in the cabinet, had already fallen. He had been demoted from the Admiralty in May, when the formation of the coalition government gave the Conservatives leverage to demand his removal. By November, even his reduced role had become untenable. He resigned from the cabinet altogether and accepted a commission to command an infantry battalion on the Western Front. The man who had staked everything on forcing the Dardanelles would spend the coming months in the trenches of Flanders, sharing the fate of the soldiers his strategy had failed to spare. Years later, Churchill would reflect on what the campaign had cost him. He had been ruined, he wrote, by trying to carry out a major operation from a subordinate position. A supreme enterprise had been cast away. Men are ill-advised to try such ventures. The lesson sank into his nature. When the Second World War found him at the pinnacle of power, he would appoint himself Minister of Defense, ensuring that he could direct military operations with the authority he had lacked in 1915. But all of that lay in the future. In November 1915, the immediate problem was how to extract over 100,000 men from 3 separate beachheads without getting them all killed. The predictions were dire. Staff officers calculated that an evacuation under fire could cost 50% casualties. The beaches were overlooked by Turkish positions. The piers and jetties were within range of enemy artillery. Any obvious preparation for withdrawal would invite a devastating attack. The Turks would realize what was happening and pour down from the heights to slaughter the retreating soldiers as they waited for boats that could only carry a fraction of them at a time. The man who solved this impossible problem was an Australian. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Dardanelles White had served as a staff officer throughout the campaign. He understood the terrain, the enemy, and the capabilities of the forces under his command. The evacuation plan he devised was a masterpiece of deception. White proposed a 3-stage withdrawal. In the preliminary phase, men and equipment would be quietly reduced in a manner consistent with a garrison preparing to spend the winter in place. The Turks would see nothing unusual. In the intermediate phase, the force would be reduced to approximately 26,000 men, just enough to hold the lines for about a week if attacked. In the final phase, those remaining troops would be extracted over 2 consecutive nights. The key to the entire plan was convincing the Turks that nothing had changed. White introduced what he called silent stunts. At irregular intervals, all firing from the Allied lines would cease completely. No rifles, no artillery, no grenades. Just silence. The first time this happened, the Turks were suspicious. They sent patrols forward to investigate. They found the trenches still manned, the defenders still alert. The silence was just a pause, nothing more. The silent stunts continued through late November and into December. Each time, the Turks investigated. Each time, they found the Allies still in position. Gradually, they stopped investigating. They became accustomed to the periods of quiet. They assumed these were simply the rhythms of a garrison settling in for winter. This conditioning would prove decisive. The other crucial innovation was the self-firing rifle, known to the soldiers as the drip rifle. The device was elegantly simple. 2 kerosene tins were arranged one above the other. The upper tin was filled with water and had a small hole punched in its bottom. As water slowly dripped into the lower tin, the weight gradually increased. The lower tin was connected by string to the trigger of a rifle fixed in a firing position. When enough water had accumulated, the weight would pull the trigger and the rifle would fire. A single drip rifle could continue firing for up to 20 minutes after the last soldier had left the trench. Hundreds of them would create the illusion that the positions were still manned long after they had been abandoned. The evacuation of Anzac and Suvla began on the 15th of December. Each night, under cover of darkness, thousands of men made their way down to the beaches and onto waiting boats. They moved in silence, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle their footsteps. Mule columns continued their normal supply runs, but now the mules were carrying men away from the front rather than ammunition toward it. The Indian muleteers who handled these animals were so skilled that hardly any noise was made. By the 18th of December, only 20,000 men remained at Anzac. The trenches that had held over 40,000 were now defended by a skeleton force maintaining the illusion of full strength. Cooking fires were lit at the usual times. Rifles cracked sporadically along the line. Everything appeared normal. On the night of the 19th, the final evacuation began. The last troops slipped away from positions they had held for 8 months. They left behind the graves of their friends, the trenches they had carved into the rocky soil, the ridges they had fought and died to hold. As they walked down to the beaches in the darkness, the drip rifles began their work. Random shots echoed across no man's land. The Turks, hearing the familiar sounds of a quiet night, suspected nothing. At 4 in the morning on December 20th, the last boat pulled away from North Beach. Not a single man had been killed in the evacuation of Anzac and Suvla. 36,000 troops had been extracted over 5 nights without the enemy realizing what was happening. The Turks did not discover that the positions had been abandoned until the following morning, when patrols found nothing but empty trenches and the ingenious rifles still occasionally firing at nothing. At Helles, the same tactics were employed in early January. The final Allied soldier left Gallipoli on the 9th of January 1916. The campaign was over. It was the only unqualified success of the entire operation. The cost of Gallipoli defies easy comprehension. The British Empire suffered over 200,000 casualties, including more than 43,000 dead. France lost 47,000 men killed and wounded. Australia counted 8,709 dead. New Zealand, 2,721. The Ottoman Empire paid an even higher price, with estimates ranging from 250,000 to nearly 300,000 total casualties, including at least 56,000 dead. And what had been gained? Nothing. Not a single strategic objective had been achieved. The Dardanelles remained closed. Constantinople remained unthreatened. Russia received no relief and would collapse into revolution within 2 years. The Balkan states remained unconvinced. The war ground on for 3 more years. But from the wreckage of the campaign, something unexpected emerged. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became the crucible of national identity. The qualities displayed on those beaches and ridges, courage, endurance, mateship, irreverent humor in the face of death, became the founding mythology of nations that had been mere colonies less than 2 decades before. April 25th would become Anzac Day, a sacred date of remembrance observed with dawn services and solemn ceremony. For Turkey, the victory at Gallipoli preserved the empire long enough for it to transform into something new. Mustafa Kemal emerged from the campaign as a national hero, the man who had stopped the invaders at the critical moment. He would lead the Turkish War of Independence, found the Republic of Turkey in 1923, and serve as its president until his death in 1938. History would know him as Ataturk, father of the Turks. And Churchill? The man who had gambled and lost would spend decades in the political wilderness, his judgment questioned, his ambition suspect. But he had learned. When another war came, when Britain stood alone against a different enemy, Winston Churchill would rise again. The lessons of Gallipoli, paid for in blood, would shape the leader who refused to surrender. The Gallipoli Campaign was born from a vision of ending the war in a single stroke. It ended as a monument to the gap between strategy and execution, between ambition and reality. 250,000 men became casualties on both sides. The Dardanelles remained closed. The war continued for 3 more years. And yet, from that failure, nations were forged. Australia and New Zealand discovered themselves on those impossible cliffs. Turkey found the leader who would carry it into the modern age. Even Churchill, broken by the disaster, would return with hard-won wisdom when his country needed him most. In 1934, Ataturk addressed the mothers of the Allied soldiers buried on Turkish soil. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, he said, "You are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Rest in peace." There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us. The beaches are quiet now. Every April 25th, they remember.